Today's hearing will examine China's motivations and strategies for acquiring data, both domestically and abroad, and how Beijing is working to integrate this vast collection into a unified, state-directed framework. Chinese leaders view data as a strategic asset, a driver of economic growth, indigenous innovation, and industrial policy, but also as a tool to shape and control global information flows in support of military and national security objectives. This approach reflects a deliberate, top-down effort to embed data dominance at the center of China's economic and geopolitical strategy. It also underscores Beijing's intent not just to compete in the digital economy, but to set the terms by which data is governed, accessed, and exploited globally. While Washington continues to debate and deliberate on this issue, Beijing has spent the better part of a decade building a comprehensive regulatory and operational architecture designed to do two things simultaneously: hoard its own data and systematically vacuum up ours. The asymmetry is stark. China's regulations, such as its cybersecurity law and data security law, are instruments of strategic data accumulation. Beijing identifies what constitutes important data and compels its companies to share such data with the state. China stockpiles software vulnerabilities reported within 48 hours of discovery and is under no obligation to disclose those vulnerabilities to foreign organizations, all to bolster its own offensive cyber capabilities. Meanwhile, Chinese scientists have legally accessed data from UK biobanks, reported as recently as last week, US genomic databases, and global data markets with relative ease, while China's similar data remain firmly off limits to foreign researchers and companies. Beijing also seeks to gain data advantage through state-sponsored cyber operations. China's Advanced Persistent Threat Groups, or APTs, have spent decades burrowing into US networks and critical infrastructure across the defense, healthcare, telecommunications, and energy sectors. The 2015 Office of Personnel Management breach alone exposed sensitive personal and security clearance data on 22.5 million Americans. And more recently, the APT known as Salt Typhoon has been conducting a years-long campaign against US government agencies. In just 1 year, from 2024 to 2025, cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike reported a 150% surge in espionage attacks and a 300% increase in targeted industrial cyber attacks. These are campaigns that are state-orchestrated, persistent, and increasingly AI-enabled. None of this is new. What is new is the scale, the sophistication, and the sobering reality that the vectors of threat are likely more comprehensive than anything we can fully imagine today. I look forward to the insights of our panelists today on both the scope of this challenge and the policy actions.
Of researchers at Georgetown University's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where my team's focus is on the intersection of AI and cybersecurity. We also study what's required to create and deploy advanced AI systems in terms of finances, semiconductors, models, and other underpinnings of the technology. These are all intense areas of competition with China. This testimony will briefly discuss Chinese acquisition of American AI technology and how AI can enhance their cyber operations going forward. And I'll conclude with a few policy recommendations to limit those risks. China's cyber teams have been targeting American defense contractors, technology companies, government agencies, and citizens for decades, but their approach and our views have evolved over time. I remember optimism 10 years ago, such as following the Obama-Xi meeting, that China might agree not to use cyber espionage for commercial gain. Today, I hear less optimism about any ideological restraint, and it seems that the CCP views cyber as one tool among many for acquiring US technology. They buy compiled datasets from data vendors, they use their positions in markets such as autonomous vehicles or commercial drones to enhance sensor coverage, they siphon off data in transit around the world as it passes through their telecommunications infrastructure, and they poach specialized knowledge of talented individuals, such as through the Thousand Talents and related programs. Now, the technology of the day is AI, and American companies developing it are often relative upstarts who have little experience as targets of sophisticated espionage campaigns, and whose business models often rely on providing access to their technology at extreme scales. Our AI companies are becoming even more enticing targets as their models and services become more capable, especially in the cyber domain. The company Expo topped the bug bounty leaderboard last year, finding more vulnerabilities than any human, and Anthropic's new mythos has the cyber world buzzing. But China does not view AI technology exactly as we do. While US AI technology giants block their services from going to China, China also uses its Great Firewall to block those services on their side. And despite loosening export controls on US AI chips last year, China has not purchased any of those chips yet. Their reluctance is due to several factors. One is to support their domestic industry. Another is to avoid reliance on American models or services that could be restricted in a conflict, that could disseminate an American worldview, or that could even be poisoned to subvert Chinese interests. Now, contrasting that reluctance, China is also aggressively stealing all aspects of AI technology. Chinese companies are smuggling billions of dollars of US AI chips. The CCP is tempting or coercing AI researchers to China using both carrots, such as the Thousand Talents programs, and sticks, as in Operation Fox Hunt. And all three US AI leaders, Alphabet, OpenAI, and Anthropic, have accused China of using American outputs to train Chinese copies using techniques known as adversarial distillation. The various forms of theft, along with their own inventiveness, have kept Chinese companies near the American frontier. The American lead is often estimated at only around 6 or 7 months. So we should expect that the AI-induced cyber advances we see today in America will come to China soon. Already, we've seen Chinese attackers string together many separate AI models to conduct complex, if relatively unsophisticated, cyber attacks in ways that threaten to upend our strategy of layered defenses. At the same time, software maintainers are already being overwhelmed by the number of vulnerabilities that AI is discovering. It's not clear yet whether AI will help them close those gaps or if it will find too many holes for them to manage. We should also expect the impacts of theft to become even more damaging as AI enhances digitization. 20 years ago, there was far less to steal online. Now, with AI becoming people's therapists and as agentification forces companies to digitize their workflows, the severity of coercion and the risk of intellectual property theft will continue to grow. Defensively, setting aside the many technical steps to take and the role that industry must play, there's plenty for federal regulators to do. As a starting point, much of the burden of preventing theft falls on the Critical Infrastructure and Security Agency, CISA, which is understaffed from layoffs, has had leadership uncertainties, and has been plagued by intermittent shutdowns as part of the Department of Homeland Security. They're a focal point for security guidance, for informing industry of threats and vulnerabilities, and they are the sector management agency for information technology. Information sharing among AI companies and the intelligence community will also be crucial as the threats continue to grow and attackers attempt to hide themselves. Much of that falls on the National Security Agency's AI Security Center and the Cybersecurity Collaboration Center. Staffing and funding CISA and those information sharing efforts is necessary to secure American AI software from theft. As for the hardware that's being smuggled, the Bureau of Industry and Security is responsible for preventing and interdicting those shipments, but they've historically been underfunded, so boosting their funding would help. Identifying smugglers remains difficult, though, so Congress can mandate location monitoring for restricted chips. Those techniques face many limitations, but the value of the chips is large and growing, so helping to find even a small fraction of illicit shipments could help make up for the cost and difficulties. Finally, and most broadly, the United States, and Congress in particular, should be cautious with the sacrifices it makes in pursuit of AI, given the alerts raised by American labs that China is freeloading off American investment. If America is to reallocate energy and water infrastructure, to finance or backstop corporations, or to provide regulatory relief for construction, privacy concerns, copyright infringement, or psychosocial harms, then the benefits should not accrue to China. Congress and the American taxpayer should demand assurances that AI developers can protect the technology as a precondition.
Document how the PRC has undertaken a systematic state-directed effort to convert data into intelligence advantage, economic leverage, coercive influence, and wartime decision superiority. In the time that I have before you today, I want to focus on just one point. The United States is still treating this challenge far too defensively. We treat breaches, privacy, and critical infrastructure as separate issues. Beijing does not see it that way. The PRC treats data as a strategic resource. It treats commercial networks as intelligence collection platforms. civilian logistics systems as potential military targets, and persistent cyber access as a form of pre-conflict positioning. That is the core problem. China is not merely stealing data. It is doing so to build an AI-enabled intelligence and targeting architecture for economic competition, political coercion, and wartime advantage. Over the last 5 years, the threat has changed in 3 key ways. First, China's cyber operations feed intelligence, military, and political objectives. That is not just traditional espionage or intellectual property theft. Campaigns associated with Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon show that the PRC is targeting the systems the United States would depend on in a crisis. Telecommunications providers, transportation networks, and civilian critical infrastructure, systems that support our military modernization. In other words, a future conflict over Taiwan would not begin only in the Taiwan Strait, it would begin at home. This is all part of China's plan to coerce, deter, and defeat the United States. Now, second, China has built an ecosystem that facilitates industrial-scale cyber operations. Let me repeat that again, industrial-scale cyber operations. The relevant actor is not only the PLA or the MSS, it is also a wider ecosystem of contractors, hacker-for-hire firms, access brokers, and even commercial technology companies. This ecosystem gives Beijing reach, deniability, and surge capacity, letting Chinese state organs acquire access and data at a scale government operators alone could not generate. Third, AI raises the strategic value of everything that China is collecting. Data that might once have sat unused in a repository can now be fused, searched, modeled, and operationalized. Telecommunications metadata can reveal networks of associations, location data, movement patterns. Health, financial, and family data can reveal personal vulnerabilities. Logistics, maintenance, and supplier data can reveal mobilization bottlenecks, weaknesses in weapon systems, and weaknesses in the defense industrial base. The result is a fusion problem that we have. Bulk commercial data, persistent cyber access, and AI are converging faster than US policy is adapting. That convergence is equally dangerous for US military and national security personnel. The Defense Intelligence Agency has warned about ubiquitous technical surveillance, which is the aggregation of data that links people to devices, locations, transactions, relationships, and patterns of life. And this is not just a theoretical problem that we have. Public reporting on Israeli operations against Iranian military and political leaders illustrates what can happen when systematic intelligence collection, cyber penetration, and data analytics are fused effectively. Senior officials can be tracked, located, targeted with a precision that would have been much harder to achieve in an earlier era. The implication is clear. Commercial data is now operational data. Civilian networks are now military-relevant terrain, and privacy exposure is a force protection risk. While we've taken important steps, including DOJ's data security program and public actions against Chinese cyber actors and infrastructure, it is not enough. The overall US response remains too focused on defense, compliance, and resilience. Those things are necessary, but they are not sufficient. If the expected return on Chinese cyber operations remains high and the expected costs remain manageable, Beijing will continue. That is deterrence 101. China will not stop because we issue advisories, patch faster, or even write better compliance rules. We have to change the cost calculus. So I would emphasize 3 recommendations. Number 1, Congress should support sustained offensive pressure against Chinese cyber operators and the infrastructure that enables them. The objective should not be episodic retaliation after major incidents. It should be continuous campaigning against adversary infrastructure, access brokers, and contractor-operated intrusion platforms. We must force Chinese operators to spend more time building access, more money defending their infrastructure, and more effort protecting their tradecraft. Right now, China has been able to impose persistent costs on us while bearing too little reciprocal burden. 2, the US should target the ecosystem, not just the government operators. Chinese cyber power is scalable because contractors, data brokers, technology vendors, and other commercial actors provide access, deniability, and surge capacity. The United States should use sanctions, criminal charges, export control, and public exposure to make participation in that ecosystem commercially dangerous and strategically costly. The message should be simple. If a company helps the MSS or PLA cyber operators target the United States and its allies, it should lose access to US capital, US technology, and US markets. 3, Congress should treat strategically relevant data as national security infrastructure. And that means codifying a national security data control regime, creating telecommunications and core network security requirements, and passing secure by design requirements for edge devices and networking gear. And it means protecting military-adjacent commercial data. Now, I am not suggesting that we copy China's model of state data control, but we have to recognize that openness without guardrails is being converted into adversary leverage. China's data acquisition strategy is not just about stealing secrets. It is about building decision advantage. It is about mapping the people, networks, infrastructure, and dependencies behind US power projection. It is about accelerating Chinese AI and military modernization, and ultimately, it is about creating options to delay, disrupt, or deter US action in a crisis. Defense alone will not restore deterrence. We need to put China's cyber ecosystem under pressure, force Beijing to spend more defending its own networks, and deny it the ability to convert American openness into strategic leverage. Thank you, and I look forward to
My core point today is simple. China has spent over a decade building a coordinated state industry response to what it sees as the foundational input of the digital and AI economy, data. The United States has not made an equivalent adjustment. The United States still has the world's most innovative firms, but they are competing in a global market shaped by a competitor that treats technology policy as a coordinated national project, while the United States treats it as a portfolio of separate regulatory and trade questions. Data governance runs on parallel tracks at Commerce, State, Treasury, the FTC, Justice and others, each handling a slice, none really responsible for the whole. We have many of the pieces, but we do not really have a data policy layer in the US tech policy stack. The gap in action between the two matters because of where we are in the global digital and AI market and the competition for market share at the moment. The competitive architecture of the next decade is being set now in procurement rules, national AI and data laws, and standards bodies. China treats data as a factor of production on equal footing with land, labour, capital and technology. President Xi has said this repeatedly since 2021, and Beijing has since built the legal, regulatory and institutional machinery to act on it. The Data 20 article sets the economic framework, the National Data Bureau, established in 2023, is operationalising it, and the World Data Organization, launched only last month in Beijing, may well become the platform to try and export it. You can see this same pattern apply in specific sectors, such as physical AI. China has built more than 40 state-funded robot data collection centres nationwide and has issued a unified data collection standard to ensure every robot generates training data in interoperable formats. Leading firms are releasing open data sets under state pressure to build shared industry infrastructure rather than proprietary moats. And you can see it in standards, with the role of China's TC260 translating Cyberspace Administration of China policy into technical standards in these specific sectors, and then aiming to take those same standards to international standards bodies. Now compare this to the United States. We withdrew from the WTO digital trade negotiations in 2023, ceding the field to both Beijing and Brussels. The Trump administration has partly corrected this, but not broadly or consistently enough. We have no national equivalent robotics data infrastructure initiative, by example, and national security-driven actions targeting data are similarly haphazard, fragmented, and often delayed. The US thankfully continues to stand behind the global cross-border privacy rule system, and likewise the Trump administration has launched the Genesis mission to put federal scientific data sets to work training AI models, and is obviously pushing ahead through the AI Action Plan and AI Exports Program. And in Congress, there's bipartisan legislative proposals that are worth considering, such as the Digital Trade Promotion Act and the National Commission on Robotics Act. But there is still no data policy layer in the US tech policy stack. We have the firms, we have some of the policies, we have some of the ideas, but we do not have the strategy that pulls it together. This brings me to Southeast Asia and the compounding effect of early entry and data collection, the flywheel. In digital markets, more users generate more data, which trains better products, which attract more users, which generates more data. Once a platform reaches critical mass in a market, displacing it becomes very difficult. In digital markets, early wins compound. And in right now, flywheel either spins for you or against you, and in Southeast Asia, it is increasingly spinning up for China. Chinese platforms hold roughly half of e-commerce gross merchandise value across several major markets. Chinese firms are laying the undersea cables and building data centres that move the region's data. Chinese cloud providers are increasingly aggressive and successful in winning contracts at prices that reflect state subsidy, not commercial cost recovery. And under China's data security law and national intelligence law, that data is legally accessible to the Chinese state, with no independent judiciary to constrain access and no transparency requirement that would allow anyone outside Beijing to know when access occurs. This is a structural difference. US firms operate under rule of law. Chinese firms operate under the rule of potential compulsion. Both compete in Southeast Asia, which is a critical market for US and Chinese firms. Only one carries a home country governance regime that turns commercial data into state accessible data and an input into its national project. The difference is that the US private sector is competing abroad largely without a coherent government strategy and toolkit behind it. Let me close with 3 categories of recommendations. First, codify US digital trade priorities. Congress should pass the Digital Trade Promotion Act to codify protections for cross-border data flows and other critical pro-digital trade provisions so they survive administration turnover, and re-engage WTO digital trade negotiations with a clear and strong position. Second, make Southeast Asia a priority theatre. Back the US ASEAN Digital Work Plan with real funding and staff at state and the Development Finance Corporation, and explicitly prioritise it under the American AI Export Program. The administration should continue to push the global cross-border privacy rules expansion. Bringing Vietnam, Indonesia and India would change the balance of data governance in the Asia-Pacific. And that should also try to operationalise the OECD trusted government access to data principles so partner countries have the legal tools to distinguish trusted from untrusted providers on grounds beyond price, which is what obviously Chinese providers excel on. Third, emulate some of the institutions China has built that we obviously haven't, such as a national industrial robotics data foundry to give US manufacturers, especially SMEs, the shared training data infrastructure that China is building at scale. The administration should push for a trusted cloud initiative with Five Eyes partners, Japan, the EU and others, to give allied governments and commercial buyers a common framework for distinguishing.
You highlight in your testimony that biotechnology and health data deserve special attention as Beijing deems this a strategic resource, not just a purely privacy issue, the way it's often viewed in the US. Can you dive into that issue a little bit more and tie it into why we should care about China's ability to access things like the UK biobanks, our American genomics databases, and other key health and bio databases in the West? And by the way, anyone else who would like to contribute to this after Mr. Lin is welcome.
Thank you, sir. I think it's important to note the sheer scale of what China is trying to accomplish in the genomic space, especially through institutions like the Beijing Genomics Institute. It's important to not just focus, I think, just on the genomics or even the health data part, but to look at that as simply one slice of an overall data aggregation, processing, and computing strategy, where what they want to be able to do is they want to obviously be able to leverage this for medical and health benefits for research, but also undoubtedly they are doing so in order to be able to do genetic level targeting. Ultimately, that is the objective. And so when we think about that, we have to think both in terms of what is China doing, what sorts of data are they making accessible, what other types of data are they trying to collect from a personal health records perspective, not just within China, but outside of it. Presumably this is so that their database has an increased amount of diversity as well. And so thinking through what are the types of protections that we have to put in place, and also that certainly applies to our own policies within the United States. How do we govern things like genomics information? How do we ensure that only the right researchers, only the right hospitals, providers have access? And how do we make sure we have the right protections in place?
I think biodata is a particularly interesting case. It's obviously been sensitive and important in China for decades, going back to 1998. And it's one where they've institutionalised domestic controls around it the earliest, in that there are rules that require genomic data to only be stored in China, to only be accessed by authorised personnel. And so they've set up the mechanism to control it, to aggregate it, and then they're now operationalising it as a part of their industrial policy.
One of your recs was for Congress and the administration to establish a national industrial robotics foundry. Can you explain that concept in a little more depth for us?
Basically, the data required to train physical AI is different from large language models. And so they can't obviously just access it publicly off the internet. And so it comes through the repetitious creation or monitoring of robots set up doing particular functions and capturing that. And so that obviously happens in individual silos in firms across America. And that lack of sharing is exactly what China's addressed by creating and forcing everyone to use the standard format. So with the use of certain robots in certain scenarios can be equally applied to another firm elsewhere. And so similarly, getting NIST and working with industry on what that equivalent standard would look like here, and then setting up pilot projects for that within existing sort of arm institutes would be essentially a way for the US to respond and start that same aggregation of common data to allow US robotics firms to benefit from what everyone else is doing, essentially.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with you, Mr. Corey. In your testimony, you gave us a fantastic overview of China's data supervision and governance landscape, explaining how certain agencies oversee regulatory aspects, some data governance aspects, some are offensive, some are defensive. So big picture, how would you characterize the structure of China's entire state-driven data framework? And is there any similarity here with how the U.S. does or does not structure its various data-related government entities?
Big picture. I think it's hard to find any comparator to what China has created institutionally in the role and the power of the CAC, the Cyberspace Administration of China, which is a regulatory and party body. And you cannot distinguish in what it does, what is a regulatory decision and what is a political decision. And it has created an apparatus and a mechanism around data on the domestic aggregation and sharing of it and the activation of its value, which it does through standards and sectoral bodies, but then obviously enacting, on the other side, strict controls on who can access that data and where that data can go. And so, I mean, as is always the case with China, they've created a central institution that acts in a way in a central coordinating function that there is no equivalent, I don't think, anywhere else in the world. And I think it's particularly interesting, the new National Data Bureau is under the National Development and Reform Commission. And that's important because that gives it an industrial policy lens as it looks at what it does. Like, don't confuse the National Data Bureau with some data protection authority. Its lens is on how do we activate the value of data in China in a centralised, coordinated manner, obviously involving all the relevant sectoral regulatory authorities and such.
I want to ask, and also maybe a little bit of a big picture question around just China's risk tolerance and how that you've seen that change. Previous intrusions, attacks showed some effort of concealment in a way. That seems like that has evolved. And so maybe beginning with Mr. Corey, I think your just sort of assessment of just the risk tolerance changing, and with that, is it changing methods? Is it changing the types of targets? Civilian versus military, but invite you to begin and then your colleagues to also.
I think I'll begin and focus on the commercial side of things, and then my co-panelists can look at the intelligence and defence aspect. But basically, China is creating an apparatus that obviously seeks to maximise the domestic accumulation and use of data in alignment with its strategic industrial policies. But akin, there's a central tension in as it does that, in that it wants to strictly control where that data is and who uses it, in that it is, I think as you mentioned at the top, the line of control the outflow, expand the inflow, as well as obviously maximising everything they generate domestically. The central part of my testimony vis-a-vis the Chinese legal apparatus providing broad, opaque state access to commercial data is at the heart of what could potentially come that my co-panelists have spoken about, in that there is no meaningful constraints on Chinese government's ability to access data and use it in any way, shape or form, whether that be for a commercial, industrial policy goal or intelligence or defence purpose. And that's baked in foundationally to the operating environment that these Chinese firms are in, whether they're operating at home or abroad. It's just that the question of the role of that opaque power has changed with the rise of AI and the increasing value of data. I mean, in final, it gives them broad authority to act however they want, whenever they want, and that's quite arbitrary. And I mean, I'm sure the Commission has heard the stories over the years, there's action and reaction as the US targets one thing with export controls or the Clean Network Initiative or whatever it may be, and then China will take a corresponding action. So they retain freedom of movement as it relates to controlling data whenever they want, essentially.
Thank you. Mr. Lim?
Yeah, Commissioner Sullivan, let me start with answering the first part of your question, which is, have we seen any change to how the PRC has looked at risk in terms of their cyber operations? And I think unequivocally the answer is yes. What we see is that China has become increasingly emboldened over the years, and unfortunately, we have ourselves to blame for that. So if you go back with me to your Thomas Schelling 101, and you look at things like signaling, you look at concepts like retaliating, and what we've done effectively is by not responding in any meaningful way, we have encouraged China to go up the escalatory ladder, right? What has our signal been? What have the consequences been to their increasingly egregious compromises of American networks? We started by saying, by justifying, rationalizing that, well, this is just state-on-state espionage, this is classic intelligence, we do it too, so there's really no difference, right? And so what have we done? We have, indicted a handful of PLA officers who probably have no intention ever of coming to the United States. We filed some démarches, and that's kind of it. And so the message to the PRC is, have at it, right? There are no consequences to your actions. And so ironically, even though we view offensive cyber operations as potentially escalatory, this has always been a concern of ours for a very long time. We can have a separate conversation about how it's actually not. Our lack of response, our focus only on defending our networks, our obsession with resilience has actually been highly escalatory and is encouraging them to now embed themselves into critical infrastructure in the United States, critical infrastructure networks, to start targeting middle America towns, water treatment facilities in Western Massachusetts. These are the types of things that they're doing now, and they think that there's no consequence to it.
With Mr. Lin, and I'd like just to pick up kind of where that last discussion left off. And so you laid out an array of measures the U.S. could take to be more effective in terms of sustaining offensive pressure against Chinese cyber operators. What would you say the obstacles to doing this thus far have been? Is it risk aversion? Is it authorities issues, concerns about escalation, all of the above? You mentioned in particular that you thought that the last issue, concerns about escalation, is overblown. So I'd just be curious to hear you talk a little bit more about what has stood in the way so far.
It's always a little daunting to be discussing deterrence theory with the Henry Kissinger professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, but I'll try to hold my own. So, when it comes, what have been the impediments? I think certainly a misguided perception about escalation and how escalatory cyber can be. For a very long time, if you think about the origins of offensive cyber, how we governed it, how we organized it, how we tried to control it, we put the predecessor to what is now U.S. Cyber Command, and actually initially U.S. Cyber Command, under the umbrella of U.S. Strategic Command. For a long time, it was believed that cyber weapons were potentially as dangerous, as escalatory, as uncontrollable as nuclear weapons, and so we had to be extraordinarily cautious. That's what defined our thinking early on. And I think the very best evidence of how non-escalatory offensive cyber operations and cyber attacks is by our lack of response to all of the attacks that China has been throwing our way. What have we actually done? Not much, right? So that's part one. Number two, your question around policies, your question around authorities. The authorities are there. I think there's a question historically around willingness, but I think starting with the first Trump administration's approach towards delegating decision authority to U.S. Cyber Command through NSPM 13, that's been a very welcome push in that direction to make it easier to lower the barriers to using offensive cyber capabilities. And I think what you're seeing now with the second Trump administration as well is a willingness, a far greater willingness to use non-kinetic and especially cyber capabilities as part of joint military operations. So I think that willingness is now there. In terms of authorities, the authorities are there. We have the authorities, whether we're talking about Title 10, 50, 18, we have them. It's just a matter of, are we willing to actually use them, to put them to use? And then number three, one of the things that you didn't mention, but I would hammer on, is have we approached this problem of force generation from the right perspective? Right? Because ultimately that's part of what we're talking about, is this is a force generation problem. And do we have the right capabilities in place? Do we have the right people in place? Do we have the right models in place where we are also able to conduct industrial scale cyber operations? For a very long time, we have approached offensive cyber operations through an artisanal lens, and we have to change that. We can no longer rely on just a handful of extraordinarily talented, committed cyber operators to be the tip of the spear. We have to figure out, how do we mobilize the entire force and ensure that they're equipped with the right capabilities to do so, rather than simply continue to try to throw more people at the problem.
Thank you. And while I have you, you referenced the ability to use data to target senior officials. And so maybe you could just expand a bit on what we've learned about this from recent military engagements. And perhaps you could just kind of paint us a little bit of a picture of what this might look like if China were to try to do something similar to the United States in a crisis or conflict scenario.
Yeah, sure. So let me talk about this both in the abstract and then, to go back into the example of at least reportedly what the Israelis have been able to do against Iranian political and military targets. The sheer amount of data that every single one of us generates, even right now in this very moment, is extraordinary. The amount of data that is being generated by our phones, which are attached to us, by our smart devices that we're wearing. All of this can be used to track pattern of life. All of this can be used to track our movements, our biodata, right? And so you can imagine that if a foreign adversary wanted to use this data to coerce individuals, to track individuals, to gain leverage over them, or in the case of at least reportedly what's happened in Iran, with what the Israelis have been able to carry out, they've been able to do highly targeted precision strikes simultaneously against entire layers of Iranian military and intelligence leadership. This is something that, going back 200 years, our military thinkers probably would have thought, or even 100 years, would have thought impossible, but this is extraordinary. And so I think we're in a brave new world. And for ourselves, what this means is twofold. One, we have to get much better at protecting that data, certainly, but we also have to think about how do we use that to our advantage as well.
Would you agree that we're seeing the Chinese sort of expanding their domains? And can you speak a little bit more to sort of how they may be pre-positioning here inside the United States? That's of concern to us, Mr. Lin. And this ties back into sort of the sort of deterrence theory and question that you were just having, conversation you were just having. But I guess I'm curious, just to help us understand and help the public understand, like, how is that pre-positioning actually taking root, and not just potential like for threats, but where specifically are we seeing them pre-position in ways they previously hadn't? Yes.
Sure. Yeah, happy to lead off. To abstract up a little bit, the best way to think about the pre-positioning that the PRC is doing now in the cyber domain is, during the Cold War, what we called counter-value targeting, right? For a very long time, we approached it, we viewed what China was doing to us from the lens of purely intelligence collection, IP theft, things like that. And then that started to broaden out where they would target our government and military networks, but we said, of course, that's what they would do, right? But now they're going after broad swaths of American society. I mentioned earlier in my remarks that they're going after things like water treatment plants in rural Massachusetts that have zero military or political value, right? So ultimately, why are they doing that? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. It's to be able to hold American society at risk so that in time of war, they can start to turn up the pain. How much pain are we willing to tolerate at home? How much are we willing to risk? This goes back to the old question of, are we willing to trade Los Angeles for Paris? Are we willing to trade, rural America, water treatment facilities for, coming to the aid of Taiwan or some other East Asian ally? And I think they believe that this is a way in which you can undermine political support for otherwise, popular national security decisions that the United States would make.
Perfect, thank you. And so just to expand that out a little bit to the rest of the panelists, if I'm sort of combining what each of you has said, you've sort of framed this as a comprehensive, systematic approach across multiple domains with far-reaching consequences to national security here within the United States, as well as to nations overseas. And I guess one of the questions I'm constantly sort of grappling with and hearing as I sort of make the rounds with folks is how much of this is nation to nation versus business to nation? And so recognizing we're here to sort of talk about US and what we can do to sort of pre-position or stop against sort of the pre-positioning here, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on how much of this should be driven sort of from a business side versus a nation side. Mr. Corey, if you don't mind leading off.
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, because when you're facing Chinese firms, you're not just facing them alone. Chinese tech firms operate in an ecosystem and a market where they're able to essentially partially socialize the development costs of what they've had to go through to come to market overseas through preferential financing, discriminatory procurement, compute support, AI and data and power support, and then obviously external market support through the Digital Silk Road and others. And so when US firms who are competing on the basis of commercial operations and price and such, and they need to recoup their costs, their considerable costs by how they operate, I mean, they're facing an entity that is not playing on the same field in that, I mean, I know for a fact that there are US cloud operators in Southeast Asia facing Chinese competitors that are providing free onboarding for new clients and are providing 60 to 80% price discounts up front. And that's just not commercially viable. And that reflects the state-supported nature of these Chinese cloud firms overseas. And so it's a different dynamic in terms of their relationship with their home government and what that means when they compete abroad.
Yeah, I would say that I agree with all of that. And the Chinese theft to support their companies is an industrial espionage that we would draw a different line on. They support their companies in all sorts of ways like that. I would also say that our companies, we might not be defending as well as we could be in lots of cases. There are several cases where their technology is being siphoned off, and we need to help identify in which ways and where the defenses are. Some of the distillation attacks that are happening right now are difficult to detect at the company level. Kyle Miller, who's here, walked me through some of that yesterday. And that the bottleneck where we might be able to have the most focus, leaning on what Joseph Lin is suggesting, is more upstream in a defense.